Well, good afternoon. We want to continue our segment on marriage. Today we're going to continue talking about communication, the importance of communication, but in a particular way, that is in conflict resolution. If you remember the last segment, we talked about the importance of communicating in the way that we already know, at least most of us know how to do. That is using words of grace. Recall that we are to be channels of God's grace to one another within our marriage. And so in order to do that, we have to communicate in a certain way. We have to use patience and forbearance. We have to not only look at what we say, but how we say it. We need to use those words and sentences that we all know are very, very important, such as please and thank you and I forgive you. Will you forgive me? Is there anything I can do for you? Is there anything I can get you? So on and so forth. Those words and phrases we all know would really cultivate a great atmosphere within our marriages. But so often we get caught in ruts. We get caught in ruts of how we communicate, in a bad way. We yell at each other. We communicate in a negative way or a critical way, and so we need to be intentional in our communication if we are to grow in this one flesh relationship. So today we're going to look at conflict resolution and talk about some of the rules of conflict resolution. But we begin by laying a theological foundation, which is very important in regards to any aspect of the sacrament of marriage. And that foundation has to do with reconciliation. We do know that Christ has brought reconciliation between us and the Father. The New Testament is very clear about that. He is our peace offering, if you will. So I want to begin by reading a couple of verses from St. Paul's epistle to the Ephesians in chapter 2, where the Apostle Paul writes, beginning at verse 14, "For he is our peace, who made both one and broke down the dividing wall of enmity through his flesh, abolishing the law with its commandments and legal claims, that he might create in himself one new person in place of two, thus establishing peace." So the Apostle Paul is talking about not only peace with God, but peace with one another, peace between Jew and Gentile. And he talks about abolishing this dividing wall. It's in reference to the wall in the court of the temple, which separated the court of the Gentiles and the court of Israel. And the Gentiles were not allowed to go beyond that wall. So Paul says that wall has been abolished in Christ. He has reconciled Jew and Gentile, brought peace between Jew and Gentile, as well as with God. Verse 16, "And might reconcile both with God in one body through the cross, putting that enmity to the death by it." And so the only thing I want to point out in these verses is that Christ is our peace. He brings reconciliation between man and also between man and God. And he brings reconciliation between man and God, between man and man, in bringing us both into the body of Christ, the church. And so with that reconciliation, we have also peace with God. This reconciliation comes through the cross, comes through the cross. And so that's our theological foundation, that when we look at marriage, we see that there is a cross to be carried. And so when we talk about conflict resolution, we must recognize that resolving conflicts with our spouses excuse me, is a part of carrying the cross of Christ in marriage. Let me point you to a couple of paragraphs in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which also talk about the cross of Jesus within the sacrament of marriage. Paragraph 1615. It is by following Christ, renouncing themselves, and taking up their crosses that spouses will be able to receive the original meaning of marriage and live it with the help of Christ. This grace of Christian marriage is a fruit of Christ's cross, the source of all Christian life. So in other words, we need grace. We need grace to fully live out the sacrament of marriage in the way God intended it, even from the beginning in creation, and we've looked at that. So how do we receive the grace of Christ? Remember, we receive it, the grace of Christ, predominantly through the sacraments. And so what does that grace do for us? That grace empowers us. It gives us the strength that we need to be the husbands and wives that Christ has called us to be in the sacrament of marriage. And what is the instrument of his grace? Well, that grace flows from his cross. And so we are also called to pick up the cross, renouncing ourselves, taking up our crosses in the sacrament of marriage. And when we do that, we are placing ourselves in the position to receive the grace of Christ that flows from his cross to us, to empower us, to give us the strength that we need to carry our crosses in marriage. Well, the question is, what makes up our crosses in marriage? Why do we say we must carry a cross in marriage? And I guess some would jokingly say, yes, my cross is very heavy in marriage, but it's really growing in who we're called to be in Christ. We need each other. We need our spouses to get to heaven. We need our spouses. That's why Christ has called us together. First and foremost, even above needing that helpmate, that companion in marriage, even above the importance of procreation in marriage, we need that helpmate in order to get to heaven. And that's why Christ has brought us together, probably the main reason, at least one of the reasons. But let me read another paragraph, paragraph 1642. Christ is the source of this grace. Just as of old God encountered his people with a covenant of love and fidelity, so our Savior, the spouse of the church, now encounters Christian spouses through the sacrament of matrimony. So Christ meets with us in our marriage. Christ dwells with them, that is, husband and wife, gives them the strength to take up their crosses and so follow him, to rise again after they have fallen, to forgive one another, to bear one another's burdens, to be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ, and to love one another with supernatural, tender, and fruitful love. Again, just like the Christian life, you cannot live the Christian life apart from the supernatural grace of Christ. It is a supernatural life. And so we have to look at the covenant of marriage within that context. The covenant of marriage continues our preparation for heaven, continues our sanctification. Through this covenant, we will grow in the image of Christ. We will gradually, and by the grace of God, we will become the husbands and wives He's called us to be. And when we are becoming those people, we are being prepared for heaven. There's a beautiful example of how the cross works within the sacrament of marriage. It's a beautiful tradition found in Croatia, where in the marriage ceremony, the couple receives a cross. And I just want to read a segment. This was posted on Scott Hahn's Facebook page not too long ago. And let me just read you the tradition. According to Croatian tradition, when a couple gets married, the priest doesn't tell them that they have found the perfect person. On the contrary, instead he says to them, "You have found your cross. It is a cross to love, to carry it with you, a cross that is not to throw away, but to treasure." In Herzegovina, the cross represents the greatest love, and the crucifix is the treasure of the house. When the bride and groom enter the church on their wedding day, they carry a crucifix with them. The priest blesses the crucifix. When the time comes to exchange their vows, the bride puts her hand on the crucifix, and the groom puts his hand on hers, so that both hands are joined together on the crucifix. The priest covers their hands with his stole as they exchange their vows, according to the rite of the church, to be faithful to each other, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, till death do them part. Then instead of kissing each other, the bride and groom kiss the crucifix. Those who witness the ceremony understand from it that if one of them leaves the other, he or she leaves Christ on the cross. After the ceremony, the newlyweds bring the crucifix to their home and put it in a place of honor. It will forever be the point of reference and the place of family prayer. In times of difficulty, the family do not go to the lawyer or the psychiatrist, but kneel down together before the crucifix in search of help from Jesus Christ. They kneel down and maybe even cry and open their hearts, asking the Lord and each other for forgiveness. They go to sleep with peace in their hearts because they have received forgiveness from the only one who has the power to save. Husband and wife will teach their children to kiss the crucifix every day and not to go to sleep like pagans without first giving thanks to Jesus. They know that Jesus is holding them in his arms and there is nothing to fear. P.S. Here is where you find the lowest divorce rate in all of Europe, in the country of Croatia. And so what a very beautiful and powerful tradition. And so we must begin, when we talk about conflict resolution, to recognize what Scott Hahn was saying. First of all, you've not married a perfect person. How quickly we are to say that about our spouses, but we need to say as well, I'm not a perfect person. So we've got two imperfect people in the sacrament of marriage. And so there's going to be conflict. There's going to be fighting. There's going to be things that need to be resolved. And so first and foremost, we must recognize this. We are imperfect people. And then number two, we must recognize the cross of Christ, that he has called us in the sacrament of marriage to carry our crosses, just like he says in the Gospels. We cannot be his disciple unless we deny ourselves, take up our crosses, and follow him. But a part of that cross that we're called to carry is a cross of love. We are called to love one another. We're called to support one another in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health. We are called, when there's conflict, to love one another, to forgive one another, to not allow our hearts to be hardened and to just go our separate ways. That's carrying the cross in the sacrament of marriage. What a beautiful tradition, though, that they go to the cross. So their first step, if they follow this tradition, is that when there's conflict, they go to the cross. They take it to the foot of the cross, and they seek reconciliation. That's important to remember regarding forgiveness. We had the parable of the unforgiving servant that we see in the Gospels, where that servant was indebted to his master with an incredible debt, an unpayable debt. And the master in his mercy forgave the servant. But then the servant in turn put into prison a fellow servant that owed him very little. And so when the other servants went and told the master became very angry. And he put that servant, that unforgiving servant, in prison until he paid the last cent. And so the New Testament is very clear. If we have received forgiveness of Christ, then we must forgive others. That the debt that we owe to Christ is insurmountable. We really couldn't pay that debt. That's why Christ died for us. That's why the cross of Christ. He paid a debt that we could never pay ourselves. And so when we look at others, we need to remember the great debt Christ forgave us through his cross. That as we stand forgiven, we in turn will forgive others of lesser debts, of lesser offenses. So that's very important if we're going to live a life of forgiveness with anyone, but in particular with our spouses. And so we've laid the theological foundation. And that theological foundation is shaped in the form of a cross. So what do we do when there's conflict? Well, there should be a practical way of conflict resolution. And what I mean by that is that we should establish, that is couples, should establish what I like to call rules of engagement for conflict resolution. You know you're going to have conflict because you're imperfect people, and yet you also know the importance of what God wills for your family, and that is reconciliation, peace, and forgiveness if that's required. We know that's the will of God. So how do we get from a conflict to resolving the conflict to actually having peace and forgiveness in our marriage? Well, let me give you some examples of rules of engagement for conflict resolution. It's just like playing a game or a boxing match or any other sport. There are rules of engagement. And so we need to think about, well, what would those rules look like between me and my spouse? Well, there are certain things that we say and do when we're in the middle of a conflict that are just not helpful. And I'll say this, that my 38 years experience of being in a happy marriage is that most of our conflicts are little things. They're little squabbles. They're things that that are small, but that they can grow and fester if they're not dealt with, and they can cause a lot of damage. And so we must be very attentive and diligent to resolve any conflict. So we're not talking about just the major conflicts, for instance, of, where are we going to live, what job to take, and those are huge things. But we're even talking about the small issues that occur almost every day in a marriage. So when we try to actively listen and we really try to be intent on our communication, that's the first step. But then what do we do when there's conflict? Well, first of all, you've got to determine, well, what is the conflict? Is there a real conflict here? Is the conflict simply miscommunication? Is it that you said something and you didn't, the way you said it or the words that you used really were not conveying the message you were trying to give? Maybe the message was just something innocent, but the way you said it and the words that you said were inflammatory. They made your spouse feel like that you were criticizing him or her, or that you were saying something negative towards him or her. I mean, that can happen, and you did not mean that at all. So that type of conflict would be easily resolved if one of you, especially the one on the receiving end, would say, okay, wait a minute, what I've heard you say is this, that you reflect back. Did I take this the right way? Now, often what we do, we just get offended. We just get offended without stopping and asking the question, okay, maybe I'm hearing this the wrong way, or maybe you're saying it the wrong way. Let's go back and okay, you tell me again, and let me make sure that I'm receiving that communication properly. So hopefully if we can do that, that's going to be an easy and quick resolution. Sometimes they're not that quickly resolved. But here's some rules to go by. We need to think of the things that we say or do that do not bring resolution, but that they either make the conflict personal, or they make it bigger, or it's just an attempt on our part to just win an argument. See, conflict resolution, the goal is not to win the argument. Conflict resolution is what it is. It is to bring peace, to where both parties, both husband and wife, feel satisfied, feel at peace with the resolution. Not that one of them has won an argument and won the battle, because if you take that approach, that's only going to be one of many battles. There's going to be a retaliation, more than likely. So again, the goal is resolution, peace, where both parties are satisfied with making peace. So what are some of the things, some of the rules you can make, some of the things that you say, this would not be good, and we need to agree to avoid saying this, and that's important that both husband and wife agree they're not going to do this. So let me give you an example, a very easy one, calling each other names. So husband and wife have to agree that when we're in a conflict, and maybe even tempers are tempted to flare, that we're not going to call each other names. We're not going to curse at each other. I'm not going to call you the B word. You're not going to call me an SOB. We're not going to call each other names. That might even include bringing your family into that. If you say to your husband, well, you are acting like your father, and you mean that in a derogatory manner, well, you're okay, Fred Jr., you need to be quiet and listen. That is not going to bring conflict resolution. Or if you say, well, you're acting just like your mother. I'm going to start calling you Ann Jr. That is not going to bring conflict resolution. That you call each other names, and that you start bringing your family into the fight. And I mean by that, your family, like your mom, your dad, your sister, your brother. You don't do that. Another rule of conflict resolution, rules of engagement that, again, husband and wife can agree upon, and I believe you should, is bringing up past grievances. So you get to the point in your conflict to where you just want to win. And you haven't resolved the previous battle, maybe a month ago, maybe a couple of days ago. And so you're gonna bring that up. You're gonna dogpile on your spouse. You're not gonna seek to deal with the conflict at hand. You're just gonna dogpile. Well, I need to have my way in this particular conflict because 2 weeks ago you got your way and I'm not happy about it, and I'm going to bring that up and I'm going to use it as a weapon against you. You're not going to receive any resolution by doing that. And so that comes to another point that's very important. Again, keeping the goal of the resolution. We want to bring peace. So again, the goal is not to win an argument or win a fight. The goal is resolution. So I'm not going to call you names. I'm not going to bring up family members and use my family against you. I'm not going to, or use your family against you. I'm not going to bring up past issues. So we need to resolve things when they occur. And so that's got to be a part of your goal as a husband and wife, to not allow conflicts to go unresolved and to be hidden in each other's hearts and grow and fester. Just a quick story of how my wife and I grew in this particular area as far as resolving conflicts. In the beginning of our marriage, and probably most of our marriage, my issue was that I would have a tendency to suppress conflict instead of resolving it, or to suppress my feelings about something. But then the problem is that you may suppress those feelings for a couple of days, and then they will come out in some other way. I believe a term for that is being passive aggressive. So if you're passive aggressive, you need to grow out of that. Now, this is what happens if you grow out of being passive aggressive. If you grow out of being passive aggressive, you might experience even more conflicts in your marriage. But you're also, if you're intent, you're also, though, going to experience more resolution. You see, the passive aggressive is that, well, I want to avoid the conflict, so I'll suppress my feelings. But the problem is that you're only delaying conflict, and it's going to make matters even worse. It's best to be upfront with your spouse and to tell them how you're feeling about a particular issue, and then work through the conflict then and there and come to resolution. See, that's the way to go. So potentially you could have more conflicts because you're speaking what's on your heart and mind, but hopefully you'll have the desire to resolve it. And if you do that, then you take care of the conflict right in the present, and then you don't have it lingering and festering and becoming an opportunity for bitterness and anger in the weeks and days to come. One of the things that we had to experience was that maybe times when we delay talking about a conflict, and so for instance, what our experience was that let's say there was a conflict to be resolved, we go to bed. My wife was taught when she was a child growing up from Ephesians, do not let the anger go down on your wrath. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. And so she was intent on resolving every issue before we went to bed, which is a great goal. And it is a biblical goal. But sometimes reality was that conflict had to be delayed before we can be resolved. So here was the scenario. So we go to bed. I'm in my passive aggressive way. I'm hoping to avoid, talking about the conflict. We could put the kids to bed. We go to bed, and then I roll over. I'm thinking everything's okay, and she's tossing and turning and huffing and puffing to get my attention in bed. And so my thought then is, I'm tired. I don't want to deal with this anyway, but I'm tired. I've got to get up and go to work, like as if she didn't have to get up and go to work tending the kids during the day. But, at that point, what is a person going to do when they're trying to shut the other person up so they can go to sleep? Well, they're going to tell their spouse whatever they want them to say. So, I would say, yes, you're right, I'm sorry. Well, was I sincere in that? No. I was just trying to go to sleep. I was trying to just suppress the conversation, to shut her up, to put it bluntly, so I could get some sleep. And hopefully, by sleeping on it, the conflict would go away. So, two problems there. Number one was she did not get a sincere, I'm sorry, a sincere apology. And number two, the conflict didn't go away. So we had to come to some type of resolution on this, that there may be times when, yes, we do need to resolve the conflict before we go to bed, that yes, our goal is to not go to bed angry with one another. And there are times that we have made peace, and then there are times where we haven't. But that became a goal. And that there are also times, depending on the conflict, where we have to just postpone it. And we have to, call a timeout, go to bed, do what we have to do, and then resolve it later. And so one of the things that we had talked about through the years is that there may be times where I say that, hey, can we put this on hold? Can we talk? I don't feel it's a good time right now. Can we talk about it later? And, can we talk about it, let's say, this Saturday, or something? I'm off from work. We can, have more time to talk about this. So if I ask for a delay and she gives that to me, then she has to respect that, first of all, and not continue to bring it up. But then I also have to fulfill my obligation, my promise, and actually not hope that the problem will go away, but that I would initiate the conversation and the conflict resolution for that particular problem. Now, if I didn't do that, then she's what? She's not going to trust me anymore. She's just going to read that, well, he just wants to sweep it under the rug and hope that it goes away. He really is not interested in bringing resolution to this issue. So if I don't follow through, then that's going to be a breach of trust. And she'll probably not ever let me postpone the conflict resolution again. So that's a rule that you can have, that you can create, that There might be a more appropriate time for conflict resolution, or there may not, but that you have to promise that you're going to follow through. You have to promise that you will reattack this conflict resolution at a more appropriate time, and that you'll actually do that. So that's a very, very important lesson that we've had to learn in our marriage. Also, too, another rule of engagement that we have learned in our marriage is that if you come to the point where you do need to stop talking about a conflict because you're getting angry, to just say, you know what, can we not talk about this? I'm getting angry. I don't want to say things that will be hurtful, and I just need a break. Can we take a break? I think that a rule should be that if the spouse says this, that you respect their wishes, that you allow them to cool off, and then again ask, okay, well, when do you think we can talk about this? One of the things that we experienced was that if I would get to that point, and this only happened a couple of times, I would get angry, and to remove myself from the situation, I would leave. I would leave the room. A couple of times I would leave the house and go for a walk, and that's okay, but it has to be agreed upon, again, as a rule of engagement, that, in other words, that you're not leaving the house and leaving the room and using it as a weapon against your spouse. That, okay, I'll just leave, she won't know what I'm thinking. Am I leaving for good? Am I that upset? Am I going to ask for a divorce? What's going to be, am I going to leave and hurt myself? I mean, why is he removing himself? And so just if you can come to an understanding, if that's a tendency to say, you are allowed to say to me, I just need to go for a walk, and I just want to cool off and think about this. Again, you gotta come to an agreement if you want to make that a rule of engagement. And it's not that it's bad, it's just that you want to agree upon that, and you recognize what's happening, that you're not leaving and using it as a weapon and wondering, making your spouse wonder what are you thinking, what's happening. There could be other rules of engagement that you could agree upon. I think the important thing is that you agree upon these rules, and even in the beginning of your marriage, I would encourage you even to make a list of them. Write them down, put them on your fridge, whatever works for you. But I think it's worth talking about, not in a moment of conflict, but actually sitting down and discussing what would our rules look like. So again, what is the goal? The goal is forgiveness. The goal is resolution. The goal is growing together in love. Again, the quicker that conflicts are resolved and not allowed to build up, the better off you'll be in your relationship. So, in conclusion, Mass is one of those very, very helpful things to do in keeping and cultivating reconciliation. We need to remember the Lord's Prayer. What does the Lord say? Forgive us. He tells us to pray, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. I think the Lord was very serious about that if we want to be forgiven, that we will forgive, and that especially applies to our spouses. So how does Mass play into this? Well, what do we do in Mass? We share the peace before we receive communion. And what does that do for us married couples? Well, that keeps us in a state of grace. That is an opportunity for us to make things right if we need reconciliation between us. Hopefully, the sign of the peace works that way for you and your spouse. Hopefully, you don't receive the Eucharist when you have an unforgiving heart, or you have an argument or fight, and you're not at peace with your spouse, because then you're adding sin on top of sin. So we've had that experience as well as a couple, where we came to the peace. One day we were celebrating daily Mass, and it was just my wife and I. And so we got to the peace. We had to work out. We had a small fight that morning. We had to work it out at the peace, and we did. That even happened when when we were Protestants. So that's why it's important to receive the sacraments as much as you can, because it's the sacraments that are going to give us the grace we need, the power that we need, the ability that we need from Christ to carry our crosses in the sacrament of marriage. So that's the end of this segment for today. God bless. Stay tuned for the next segment on the sacrament.